My name is Jeanette, 35 years old, and I am the Senior Compliance Specialist at Meridian Financial Services. For 10 years, I have meticulously safeguarded our company against regulatory violations. Then Marcus Reynolds became VP of Operations, dismissing my work as unnecessary bureaucracy. When regulators announced a surprise audit, Marcus laughed. She is too focused on audits. He never saw what was coming. Before I continue my story, let me know where you are watching from. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever dealt with someone who undermined your expertise. Trust me, what happens next is pure corporate justice. At Meridian Financial Services, my job as Senior Compliance Specialist carries tremendous responsibility. We handle billions in client assets, and one regulatory misstep could trigger massive fines or worse, damage our reputation beyond repair. Compliance is not just paperwork, it is the backbone of financial integrity. We ensure every transaction, every client interaction, and every internal process adheres to increasingly complex regulations that protect consumers and maintain market stability. My compliance team is small but dedicated. Abigail, my mentor with 20 years of experience, taught me everything about navigating regulatory waters with both precision and diplomacy. Richard joined us just 6 months ago, fresh from his regulatory affairs degree, eager but still learning the practical applications of compliance theory. Diana, our data analyst, possesses an almost supernatural ability to spot documentation discrepancies. Together, we form a compliance firewall that has kept Meridian safe for years. Unfortunately, Meridian cultivates a corporate culture where profit margins frequently overshadow procedural integrity. Quarterly earnings calls drive decision-making, while compliance concerns are often treated as annoying obstacles rather than essential safeguards. This attitude cascades from the executive suite, particularly from one individual, Marcus Reynolds. Marcus rocketed through company ranks despite his limited understanding of regulatory frameworks. 4 years ago, he arrived from a competitor bank as Director of Business Development. Within 18 months, he secured the VP of Operations position, overseeing nearly 200 employees across 6 departments. His close friendship with CEO Timothy Bradford undoubtedly accelerated his ascent. Timothy and Marcus belonged to the same exclusive country club, golfed together on weekends, and shared an alma mater. My history with Marcus began the day after his promotion to VP. I had flagged potential compliance issues with a new loan processing system his team wanted to implement. In the executive meeting, I explained the regulatory risks. Jeanette, Marcus interrupted, smiling condescendingly. These regulations are just red tape. We cannot let bureaucracy stop innovation. Despite my detailed analysis, Timothy nodded along with Marcus. The system launched without addressing the compliance gaps I identified. 3 months later, when minor violations emerged, Marcus blamed technology limitations rather than acknowledging the ignored warnings. This pattern repeated countless times. Marcus would dismiss compliance concerns, push forward with business initiatives, then deflect responsibility when problems inevitably surfaced. His standard phrases became predictable. Compliance is being overly cautious. These rules are theoretical, and my personal favorite, nobody actually enforces that regulation. Last year, regulatory authorities introduced significant changes to client documentation requirements. Financial institutions received 12 months to implement these changes. I developed a comprehensive implementation plan and presented it to the executive team 11 months ago, highlighting the substantial documentation updates required in operations. Marcus promised to allocate resources but repeatedly delayed. We have more pressing priorities, he would say during monthly follow-ups. My team cannot stop servicing clients to shuffle paperwork. As the deadline approached, my warnings grew more urgent, but they fell on increasingly hostile ears. In executive meetings, Marcus mastered the art of silencing me without appearing openly antagonistic. He would acknowledge my concerns with a dismissive nod before changing the subject. If I persisted, he would exchange knowing glances with Timothy, prompting our CEO to move the agenda forward. My voice diminished while my anxiety about our compliance posture intensified. Not everyone in leadership ignored my concerns. Patrick Morgan, our CFO, often sought my guidance privately. I appreciate your thoroughness, Jeanette, he told me once, after a particularly tense meeting. But you know how things work here. Marcus has the CEO ear. Patrick understood the financial risks of non-compliance, but avoided direct confrontation with Marcus. The compliance neglect reached critical mass 3 months ago, when the Financial Services Authority announced regulatory examinations would intensify following industry-wide violations at several competing institutions. I presented this development to the executive team, emphasizing our vulnerability in client documentation areas. "The FSA is just flexing," Marcus declared confidently. "They always announce these crackdowns, but actual enforcement is selective." 2 days later, we received notice that Meridian had been selected for a comprehensive regulatory audit scheduled to begin in 30 days. The examination would cover 2 years of transactions with particular focus on the new documentation requirements. My stomach dropped when I read the audit scope. We were precisely 30 days away from a regulatory reckoning that could have been avoided had Marcus taken compliance seriously. Timothy called an emergency executive meeting that afternoon. For once, nobody interrupted me as I outlined our preparedness gaps. The audit clock had started ticking, and suddenly everyone wanted answers from compliance. Everyone except Marcus, who sat back in his leather chair, inexplicably untroubled by what loomed ahead. The comprehensive audit notification from the Financial Services Authority sent shockwaves through most of the executive team, but not Marcus. While others scrambled to understand the implications, I immediately assembled my compliance team to assess our preparedness. We worked through the night, creating a gap analysis dashboard that confirmed my worst fears: operations had the most significant documentation deficiencies. The next morning, I requested an urgent meeting with the executive leadership. Around the polished mahogany table sat Timothy, Patrick, Marcus, and the other department heads. I distributed my findings color-coded for impact severity. Operations glared in alarming red. "As you can see," I explained, pointing to the dashboard, "we have critical gaps in client verification, documentation, transaction authorization records, and supervisory approvals. Most concerning are the high-value transactions processed in the last 6 months without proper regulatory documentation." Marcus leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "Jeanette, while I appreciate your thoroughness, I think you are overreacting." "Overreacting?" I tried to keep my voice steady. "These are mandatory requirements that became effective last month. We had a year to implement them." Marcus laughed, looking around the table for support. "She is too focused on audits. We have a business to run. My team processes thousands of transactions daily. We cannot halt operations every time regulators dream up new paperwork." Timothy frowned, glancing between the dashboard and Marcus. "How serious is this exposure?" Before I could answer, Marcus interjected. "Minimal. These are procedural technicalities. The substance of our operations is sound." With respect, I countered, "These are not technicalities. Missing documentation on high-value transactions carries potential penalties of up to $2 million per violation. Given the volume in operations, our exposure could be substantial." Patrick shifted uncomfortably. "That would impact our quarterly projections significantly." Marcus waved dismissively. "Assuming we get caught, assuming they care about these specific documents, and assuming maximum penalties. 3 big assumptions." I watched several executives relax at Marcus's reassurance despite the concrete evidence before them. Timothy turned to me with his resolution face. "Jeanette, please handle this quietly. Work with Marcus to address the most critical items before the audit. We cannot alarm the entire organization." The meeting adjourned with vague commitments but no concrete action plan. I immediately emailed Marcus requesting time to discuss remediation steps. His response came hours later. "Schedule something next week with my assistant." Next week was too late. I bypassed protocol and went directly to his office. His administrative assistant, Sophia, looked surprised, but buzzed me in after I insisted it was urgent. Jeanette, Marcus greeted without looking up from his computer. "This is unexpected." "We need to address the documentation gaps immediately," I said, standing, because he had not offered me a seat. "The audit is in 26 days. Yes, he finally looked up. "My team is aware of your concerns." "Awareness is not action," I replied. "I need access to the transactions flagged in my report so we can begin remediation." "You will have it," he assured, with practiced smoothness. "I will have Kevin coordinate with you tomorrow." "Thank you," I said, unconvinced but hopeful. Tomorrow came and went with no word from Kevin. My follow-up emails received automated replies. Out of office, urgent matters, contact Marcus Reynolds. My calls to Marcus went to voicemail. 3 precious preparation days vanished. Meanwhile, I documented everything meticulously. Every email, every meeting, every follow-up attempt went into a dedicated folder labeled FSA Audit Preparation. I recorded dates, times, and exact wording of verbal exchanges. This documentation ritual had saved me before, and instinct told me I would need this protection again. The stress began affecting my personal life. I canceled vacation plans with my sister Amy and her children. I am so sorry, I told her over the phone. This audit has me working 14-hour days. You always put that job first, Amy sighed. They do not appreciate you, Jeanette. I missed Sunday dinner with my parents for the first time in months. My father, who had taught me the value of integrity in his 30 years as a public school principal, was understanding but concerned. You sound exhausted, sweetheart, he said when I called to apologize. I am, I admitted, but I cannot let this audit go badly. Too much is at stake. Back at the office, my team felt the pressure too. Richard, still new and idealistic, suggested more drastic measures. We should go directly to the board, he proposed during our late-night preparation session, or maybe even contact the FSA directly. Whistleblowing is the absolute last resort, I cautioned him. It would destroy careers, possibly including ours, and damage the company reputation. We have to try working within the system first. Abigail nodded in agreement. Richard, Jeanette is right. But Jeanette? She turned to me with the wisdom of her 20 years. In compliance, you need to protect yourself. Document everything. When this audit happens, the blame will start flying. On the 18th day before the audit, while reviewing board communications for audit preparation, Diana discovered something troubling. Jeanette, you need to see this, she said, placing a board presentation on my desk. The quarterly compliance status report to the board presented by Marcus 3 weeks earlier showed all departments at green compliance status, directly contradicting my findings that had shown operations in critical red status. He misrepresented our compliance posture to the board, I whispered, the implications washing over me. This was beyond negligence. It was deliberate misrepresentation. That night I barely slept. Marcus was not just ignoring compliance, he was actively concealing deficiencies from the board of directors. The audit was approaching rapidly, my warnings were being dismissed, and now I had evidence of potential misconduct. My professional integrity and the company reputation hung in the balance, with the clock ticking relentlessly toward the audit date. With just 2 weeks until the FSA audit, I called an emergency compliance status meeting. Every executive and department head filed into our largest conference room. The tension was palpable. Even Timothy looked concerned as I distributed the updated compliance readiness reports. Thank you for making time for this critical update, I began, forcing confidence into my voice. As you can see, we have made progress in most departments, but significant gaps remain in operations. With only 14 days until the audit, these deficiencies represent substantial regulatory risk. I displayed a detailed slide showing exactly which documentation was missing. Verification forms for high-value clients, supervisory approvals for transactions exceeding regulatory thresholds, and proper records for cross-border transfers. The data painted an undeniable picture. These are not optional requirements, I emphasized. They are core regulatory obligations that the FSA specifically mentioned in their audit notification. Marcus sighed loudly, drawing all eyes to him. Jeanette, while I respect your commitment to compliance, I think you are being theoretical rather than practical. Theoretical, I repeated, struggling to maintain my professional tone. Yes, theoretical, he continued with practiced confidence. My team processes over 5,000 transactions daily. The documentation you are focusing on affects perhaps 1% of those. The FSA understands that operational efficiency sometimes requires practical adaptations to their guidelines. Several executives nodded, clearly relieved by his dismissal of my concerns. I felt my credibility eroding with each confident word from Marcus. With respect, Marcus, that is not how regulatory compliance works. The requirements are not suggestions, and the FSA does not grade on a curve. Missing documentation on even a small percentage of transactions constitutes violations. Marcus leaned forward, his voice taking on a condescending tone that had become all too familiar. Jeanette, how many years did you work in operations before moving to compliance? The question blindsided me. I have not worked in operations, but I have been in compliance for over 10 years and… Exactly my point, Marcus interrupted. Those of us who run operational departments understand the practical realities of implementing these theoretical requirements. We make risk-based decisions every day about resource allocation. I felt my face flush with a mixture of anger and embarrassment. Regulatory requirements are not theoretical and compliance is not optional. Patrick attempted to mediate, clearing his throat. Perhaps we need to prioritize. Jeanette, which documentation issues pose the greatest financial risk? Before I could answer, Marcus interjected. That is precisely my point. We should focus on material issues, not chase paperwork for its own sake. Timothy finally spoke, his tone making it clear he wanted this discussion to end. Jeanette, I understand your concerns, but we need practical solutions. Work with Marcus to address the highest risk items, but do it in a way that does not disrupt our operations. We have clients depending on us. Make it work was the implied directive. The meeting concluded with vague assurances but no concrete commitments. As everyone filed out, Marcus caught my eye and smiled slightly, the smile of someone who had won yet another round. I returned to my office feeling defeated and isolated. The weight of the impending audit pressed on me like a physical burden. For the first time in my career, I seriously contemplated resignation. Perhaps Amy was right. Perhaps this company did not deserve my loyalty. That evening, while most staff had gone home, I visited our secure document repository to begin assembling what records we did have for the audit. As I searched for files related to several high-value transactions, I discovered entire categories of documentation were missing. These were not minor oversights, but systematic failures to maintain required records. I took the elevator to the executive floor. Most offices were dark, but light still spilled from Marcus's corner suite. His assistant was gone, so I knocked directly on his door. Come in, he called, sounding irritated at the interruption. I entered with the file list in hand. Marcus, I need to speak with you about these missing transaction records. He barely looked up from his computer. Can this wait until tomorrow? I have a budget presentation to finish. No, it cannot wait. The FSA will specifically request these records and they simply do not exist in our system. This got his attention. He leaned back in his chair, studying me with narrowed eyes. What exactly are you looking for? Supervisory approval documentation for the Westlake Transactions client verification forms for the overseas transfers, processed in April, and risk assessment records for the commercial lending portfolio. Those documents exist, he stated flatly, where because they are not in the compliance repository where they should be. My team maintains some documentation separately due to confidentiality concerns. This was the first I had heard of any separate documentation system. That violates our record-keeping policy. All compliance documentation must be centrally accessible. Jeanette, his voice took on that condescending tone. Again, you are becoming hysterical over paperwork. My department is in compliance with the spirit of the regulations. The documentation exists, just not in the format or location you prefer. I need access to those records immediately to prepare for the audit, I insisted. Marcus stood up, signaling the conversation was over. Submit a formal request through proper channels and my team will respond appropriately. The audit is in 14 days, Marcus. Formal requests take at least that long to process. He smiled thinly. Then I suggest you started sooner. Now, if you will excuse me, I have actual work to complete. As I turned to leave, he added, Jeanette, your constant alarmism is being noticed. For someone in your position, job security depends on being a team player. The thinly veiled threat hung in the air as I walked out. Back in my office, I sat at my desk, hands shaking with a mixture of anger and anxiety. Marcus had essentially admitted that proper documentation did not exist while simultaneously threatening my position for doing my job. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts. Diana stood in the doorway, her expression concerned. I overheard your meeting with Marcus, she admitted. I stayed late to finish the audit preparation spreadsheets. How much did you hear? I asked. Enough to know he is hiding something, Diana replied, stepping into my office and closing the door. There is more you need to see. She placed a folder on my desk containing printouts of internal system logs. These show deletion of compliance records for operations transactions 3 months ago. Someone with executive access removed documentation from the system after it was properly filed. I stared at the evidence, the implications clear and disturbing. This was not mere negligence. It appeared to be deliberate obstruction. What are you going to do? Diana asked quietly. I made a decision that would change everything. Prepare 2 sets of audit materials, I instructed. One with whatever documentation Marcus provides, and another with all the evidence of compliance failures, including these system logs and my communication records. That night, I stayed until almost midnight, meticulously compiling evidence of every compliance warning I had issued, every dismissal from Marcus, and every attempt to remedy the situation. I created a comprehensive timeline showing the systematic disregard for regulatory requirements. If Marcus wanted to play hardball, he would find I was more prepared than he imagined. The morning of the audit arrived with a tense atmosphere permeating every corner of Meridian Financial. Security escorted the FSA audit team to our executive conference room at precisely 9 o'clock. Lead auditor Alexandra Bennett introduced herself with commanding presence, her gray suit impeccably pressed and her expression professionally neutral. Senior auditor James Thompson flanked her right, while 2 junior auditors' notebooks ready completed the team. Timothy welcomed them with corporate warmth that did not quite reach his eyes. The entire executive team sat around the conference table, including a surprisingly relaxed Marcus. I sat at the far end, my dual audit binders positioned neatly before me. Meridian Financial appreciates the opportunity to demonstrate our compliance program. Timothy began with rehearsed confidence. We pride ourselves on maintaining the highest regulatory standards. Alexandra nodded professionally. We look forward to reviewing your compliance frameworks. As outlined in our notification, this comprehensive examination will focus on transaction documentation, client verification processes, and supervisory controls over the past 2 years. I noticed Marcus shift slightly at the specific mention of the areas I had flagged as deficient, but his expression remained impassive. Before we begin, Alexandra continued, I would like to meet the compliance team responsible for regulatory adherence. I stood and introduced myself. Jeanette Parker, Senior Compliance Specialist. My team includes Abigail Reynolds, Diana Chen, and Richard Miller. Marcus immediately interjected, rising from his seat. And of course, all operational departments maintain their own compliance protocols under my supervision as VP of Operations. We have prepared comprehensive documentation demonstrating our adherence to all applicable regulations. I caught the subtle exchange of glances between Alexandra and James. They had likely conducted hundreds of audits and recognized the telltale signs of an executive attempting to control the narrative. Alexandra smiled politely. Thank you, Mr. Reynolds. We will certainly review all departmental procedures. Now, shall we proceed with our initial documentation requests? The audit team divided responsibilities with Alexandra and James, focusing on high-risk areas, while the junior auditors handled routine compliance verification. As we adjourned to begin the examination process, Alexandra approached me directly. Ms. Parker, I would like to start with your compliance management system. Could you show me how you track regulatory changes and implementation across departments? Of course, I responded, relieved to begin with an area I had maintained meticulously despite operations resistance. Throughout that first morning, I walked Alexandra through our compliance tracking system's policy documentation and training records. She took detailed notes occasionally, asking pointed questions that revealed her thorough understanding of regulatory requirements. Your compliance framework documentation is quite comprehensive, she observed. Now I would like to see how these policies translate to actual transaction records, particularly in operations. This was the moment I had been anticipating with dread. I can show you our compliance repository structure, but for specific operations transactions, we will need Mr. Reynolds or his designated staff. Alexandra raised an eyebrow almost imperceptibly. Please arrange that immediately. I messaged Marcus, who responded that he was delegating the task to Kevin Porter, his operations manager. When Kevin arrived 30 minutes later, he appeared notably uncomfortable. Kevin Auditor Bennett needs to review documentation for high-value transactions processed in the last quarter, I explained. Kevin glanced at his tablet. I can provide summary reports, but some of the detailed documentation might require additional time to compile. Alexandra's expression remained neutral, but her tone sharpened slightly. We specifically outlined the required documentation in our audit notification sent 30 days ago. Are you saying those records are not readily accessible? They exist, Kevin assured quickly, echoing Marcus's earlier claim. They are just stored across different systems for operational efficiency. Alexandra made a note. Please have the complete files for these 20 transactions ready after lunch, she instructed, handing Kevin a list. As the first day progressed, I maintained detailed notes of all interactions, document requests, and responses from various departments. Other areas showed minor compliance issues that were quickly addressed. Human Resources had documentation gaps in staff certification records, but the HR director immediately presented a remediation plan that satisfied the auditors. Legal had misclassified certain customer communications but demonstrated the error was isolated and already corrected. Operations remained the glaring exception. By late afternoon, Kevin had produced only partial documentation for 3 of the 20 requested transactions. Alexandra's patience was visibly wearing thin when Marcus finally appeared. I understand there may be some confusion about documentation formats, he began smoothly. Our operations processes are highly efficient, but sometimes utilize storage protocols that differ from traditional systems. Alexandra's response was measured but direct. Mr. Reynolds' regulatory requirements specify not just the content but the accessibility of compliance documentation. Records that cannot be produced during an examination are considered non-existent from a regulatory perspective. Marcus smiled confidently. I assure you by tomorrow morning we will have everything organized in the format you prefer. As the auditors left for the day, I overheard Alexandra instructing James to adjust tomorrow's examination strategy. The implication was clear: they were already identifying potential regulatory violations. The executive team gathered for a post-audit debriefing in Timothy's office. Marcus spoke first, his tone dismissive. Day 1 as expected. Auditors always nitpick documentation formats to assert their authority. By tomorrow we will have addressed their administrative concerns. I could not remain silent. These are not formatting issues, Marcus. The documentation either exists or it does not. Kevin could not produce most of the requested transaction records. Marcus shot me an icy glare. Kevin is still assembling the files from our various storage systems. Everything will be ready tomorrow. Timothy looked between us, clearly concerned. Are we at risk here, Jeanette? Before I could answer honestly, Marcus interjected. Absolutely not. This is standard audit theater. They probe for weaknesses, we demonstrate compliance. They move on. As the meeting concluded, Patrick pulled me aside in the hallway. How bad is it really? He asked quietly. Worse than Marcus is admitting, I answered honestly. The documentation does not exist, Patrick. It was never created, or was deliberately removed. His face fell. Can you help fix this before they dig deeper? I have been trying to fix this for months, I reminded him. Marcus blocked every attempt. That evening, Alexandra requested a private conversation as the audit team prepared to leave. Miss Parker. She began once we were alone. In the conference room, in my 15 years conducting financial examinations, I have developed a sense for when documentation is merely disorganized versus when it is non-existent. Would you like to share your perspective on what we encountered today? I stood at a professional crossroads. My loyalty to Meridian battled with my obligations as a compliance officer. I can confirm that all documentation requests have been communicated to the appropriate departments, I answered carefully. Alexandra studied me for a moment. Tomorrow we will focus extensively on operations high-risk transactions. I suggest everyone come prepared. Her words carried clear subtext. The real examination was just beginning and they had already identified their target. By day 3 of the audit, the tension at Meridian had escalated from concern to near panic. Alexandra and her team arrived promptly at 8:30, their expressions noticeably more severe than previous days. They had spent the second day reviewing whatever partial documentation operations had managed to provide, which amounted to less than 40% of what had been requested. Alexandra wasted no time with pleasantries. This morning, we need to examine the complete documentation for the Westlake commercial property portfolio transactions, she stated, handing Marcus a specific list of 15 high-value transactions. These exceeded regulatory thresholds and require enhanced due diligence records. Marcus maintained his confident demeanor. Of course, Kevin is finalizing those files now and will deliver them by this afternoon. Alexandra's patience had visibly worn thin. Mr. Reynolds, yesterday you assured us these records would be ready this morning. This is now the third consecutive day you have promised documentation for tomorrow. Compiling records from our various systems takes time, Marcus responded smoothly. We want to ensure you receive complete files rather than partial information. Before Alexandra could respond, Timothy interjected. I would like to call a brief executive meeting before we proceed further. He turned to Alexandra. Would you mind giving us 30 minutes? I want to ensure my team fully understands the urgency of your requests. Alexandra checked her watch. 30 minutes, Mr. Bradford. Not a minute more. In the executive boardroom, Timothy closed the door and turned to Marcus, his composure finally cracking. What the hell is happening? You assured me everything was under control. Marcus immediately went on offense. The compliance team failed to properly prepare us for this examination. Jeanette has been tracking regulatory changes but not effectively communicating implementation requirements to operational departments. I could not believe his audacity. That is categorically false. I have emails, meeting minutes, and formal implementation plans dating back 11 months, all directed to operations, all acknowledged by you personally. Receiving documentation is not the same as understanding practical implementation priorities, Marcus countered. Your team should have worked directly with my staff, rather than sending theoretical compliance guidelines. Patrick interrupted the blame game. The issue now is not who failed, but how we address the auditor's concerns immediately. What documentation actually exists, and what does not. A heavy silence fell over the room. Marcus finally admitted some of the enhanced due diligence forms may not have been fully completed for certain transactions. The documentation requirements changed midway through the Westlake portfolio processing. They did not change midway, I corrected firmly. The requirements were announced with a 12-month implementation period, which ended before these transactions were processed. Timothy paced the room, his face ashen. What happens if we cannot produce these documents? I answered truthfully. The FSA will likely issue an enforcement action, require a formal remediation plan, and potentially impose financial penalties for each violation. How much? Timothy demanded. Based on the transaction values, potentially hundreds of thousands per violation. Timothy turned to Marcus. Fix this now. I don't care how you do it, but get those documents to the auditors today. I need Jeanette's team to help reconstruct the documentation, Marcus responded suddenly, eager for compliance assistance. I shook my head firmly. Reconstructing documentation during an active examination would constitute a regulatory violation itself. I cannot participate in that. Then what do you suggest? Timothy snapped. We disclose the gaps, honestly present our plan to address deficiencies going forward, and accept the consequences of past failures, I stated plainly. Unacceptable, Timothy declared. Marcus, work with your team to produce whatever documentation you can. Jeanette, either help fix this or stay out of the way. We returned to the auditors exactly 30 minutes later. Marcus assured Alexandra that all requested documentation would be available by 3 o'clock that afternoon. Her skepticism was palpable. That night, long after normal business hours, I searched our archive systems for any relevant records that might help mitigate the growing disaster. In a seldom-used storage area, I discovered something disturbing, a box of shredded documents. Examining the fragments carefully, I could make out portions of client verification forms and transaction approvals, all dated within the examination period. While I was processing this discovery, Diana texted me. Need to speak privately. Still in office. We met in the empty cafeteria. Diana looked nervous, glancing around to ensure we were alone. "I found something while helping Kevin search for the missing documentation," she whispered, sliding her tablet across the table. On the screen was an email from Marcus to Kevin dated 6 months earlier. Effective: immediately suspend enhanced documentation protocols for premium clients. Continue normal processing but avoid creating compliance bottlenecks. We'll discuss offline. My blood ran cold. This was not mere negligence. It was deliberate circumvention of regulatory requirements. A second email followed. Remove previous enhanced documentation records from main system. Store offline until new streamlined process is approved. There is more, Diana continued. After the audit was announced, Marcus held an operations team meeting that excluded compliance. A staff member told me they were instructed to organize documentation to present the best possible picture. I thanked Diana for her courage in sharing this information and returned to my office to update my evidence file. I had been maintaining meticulous records of all compliance interactions, but these new discoveries elevated the situation from serious deficiencies to potential misconduct. The following morning, we received the news I had been dreading. Alexandra announced that the FSA was officially stopping the audit clock, a serious procedural step indicating potential significant violations. Due to Meridian's repeated failure to produce required regulatory documentation despite multiple requests, we are suspending the standard examination timeline, Alexandra announced in the executive conference room. We are granting Meridian 24 hours to produce the missing documentation before we escalate this matter to enforcement proceedings. Timothy's face drained of color. Miss Bennett, I assure you we are working diligently to address your concerns. 24 hours, Mr. Bradford, Alexandra replied firmly. After that, we will make formal findings based on whatever documentation exists at that time. After the auditors departed for the day, Timothy called an emergency meeting with the board's audit committee chair, Marcus Patrick, and me. The atmosphere was funereal as Timothy explained the situation. How did we get here? Demanded Gerald Hamilton, the audit committee chair. Our board reports showed compliance status as fully satisfactory across all departments. Timothy looked to Marcus, who shifted uncomfortably. There appears to have been some miscommunication between operations and compliance regarding documentation requirements, Marcus offered weakly. Miscommunication? I could no longer contain myself. The board was explicitly misinformed. The compliance status reports presented to the board showed all green metrics when operations was clearly in critical red status, as my original reports indicated. Gerald turned sharply to Marcus. Is this accurate? Before Marcus could respond, I continued. I have both the original compliance reports I submitted and the modified versions that were presented to the board. They do not match. This is becoming a governance issue, Gerald stated grimly. Timothy, I need you and Marcus to leave the room so I can speak with Jeanette privately. Once they left, Gerald fixed me with an intense gaze. Jeanette, I need the unvarnished truth. How bad is this situation? Bad, I admitted. We have systematic documentation failures across operations, particularly for high-value transactions. Worse, I have evidence suggesting documentation requirements were deliberately circumvented, and existing records may have been removed from our systems. Gerald's expression darkened further. Do you have documentation supporting these claims? Yes. I have maintained records of all compliance warnings, implementation plans, and follow-up attempts. I also have evidence of potential misconduct in handling documentation after the audit was announced. I will need to see everything, Gerald stated. As I left that meeting, I passed the operations department where Marcus had called an emergency team gathering. The door was ajar and I clearly heard him instructing staff. We need these forms completed by morning. Use the template and backfill the information based on the transaction records. Make sure the dates align with processing timeframes. I froze, realizing Marcus was directing his team to create documentation after the fact, a serious regulatory violation that could compound our problems exponentially. That night, I faced the most difficult ethical decision of my career. Allow the fabrication of documentation to proceed, potentially mitigating immediate regulatory consequences, but becoming complicit in misconduct, or intervene, and likely trigger serious regulatory enforcement against my own company. I barely slept, weighing my professional obligations against company loyalty. By morning, I had made my decision. Whatever happened next would change everything, but integrity had to prevail over expedience. The final audit meeting began at 9 o'clock sharp in our largest conference room. The tension was suffocating as Alexandra and her team entered with expressionless faces. On our side sat the full executive team, several board members, including Gerald Hamilton, and department heads. Marcus appeared surprisingly confident, a thin folder placed precisely before him. Timothy opened with practiced corporate diplomacy. Before we begin, I want to assure the examination team that Meridian takes regulatory compliance with utmost seriousness. Any documentation gaps identified are being addressed comprehensively. Alexandra nodded curtly before responding. This meeting will determine whether Meridian Financial Services has satisfied our documentation requests or if formal enforcement proceedings will commence. Let us proceed directly to the most critical open items. She turned to Marcus. Mr. Reynolds, yesterday, you assured us the complete Westlake portfolio transaction documentation would be available this morning. Is that correct? Yes, Marcus replied smoothly. My team worked through the night to compile the complete files. He slid the folder toward Alexandra with an air of satisfaction. As Alexandra began reviewing the documents, her expression remained neutral, but I noticed her exchanging subtle glances with James. After several minutes of silent review, she looked up. Mr. Reynolds, these forms appear to be in perfect order. Remarkably so, given your difficulty producing them for the past 3 days. Marcus smiled. As I explained, our documentation systems are compartmentalized for security purposes. It simply took time to compile everything properly. Alexandra turned a page in the folder. I noticed these client verification forms are all signed and dated appropriately with consistent handwriting across multiple months of transactions. Our client relationship manager maintains strict documentation standards, Marcus explained. Alexandra leaned forward slightly. Mr. Reynolds, our examination team has already reviewed the transaction processing logs from your core system. According to those logs, several of these transactions were processed after hours by personnel who would not have had direct client contact for verification purposes. Could you explain how client verification forms were completed under those circumstances? A flicker of uncertainty crossed Marcus's face. I would need to review the specific transactions you are referring to. Of course, Alexandra replied, her tone sharpening. Let us look at the Westlake commercial property acquisition dated April 15th. According to system logs, this $8 million transaction was processed at 11:47 p.m. by a back-office processor, yet the client verification form is signed and dated the same day. Marcus adjusted his tie. Perhaps the form was completed earlier and processed later. Perhaps, Alexandra conceded. However, similar patterns appear across all 15 transactions we flagged for review. Additionally, the forms show consistent signature positioning and ink intensity that would be highly unusual for documents completed over a 6-month period by different individuals. The implication hung heavily in the room. Alexandra was suggesting the documentation had been created after the fact. Timothy intervened, clearly sensing danger. Miss Bennett, if there are concerns about specific documents, we would be happy to provide additional context. Alexandra ignored him, focusing intently on Marcus. Mr. Reynolds, as VP of Operations, you are ultimately responsible for documentation integrity in your department. Were these forms created recently in response to our examination requests? The room fell silent. Marcus glanced quickly at Timothy, who appeared frozen before responding defensively. The documentation requirements changed frequently. My team has done its best to maintain proper records while managing operational demands. Alexandra was relentless. That does not answer my question. Were these specific documents created after our examination began? Marcus's composure finally cracked. The substance of the transactions is perfectly sound. Any documentation issues are merely procedural and do not reflect the underlying quality of our business practices. Alexandra turned away from Marcus, her expression making clear she had her answer. Since operations appears unable to provide a direct response, perhaps we should hear from compliance. She turned toward me, and suddenly every eye in the room followed. Miss Parker, As Senior Compliance Specialist, what can you tell us about the documentation practices for these high-value transactions? This was the moment of truth. Marcus stared at me with a mixture of threat and pleading, while Timothy seemed to be silently commanding me to protect the company. Gerald Hamilton, however, gave me the slightest nod of encouragement. I opened the comprehensive folder I had prepared and distributed copies to everyone in the room. Miss Bennett, I have compiled a complete timeline of compliance activities related to the documentation requirements under examination. Marcus's face drained of color as he glanced at the first page. This timeline shows when regulatory changes were announced, when I communicated implementation requirements to all departments, specific guidance provided to operations, and subsequent follow-up attempts. I turned to the second page. This section documents every warning I issued regarding compliance gaps in operations, including emails, meeting minutes, and formal risk assessments. Alexandra reviewed the material with intense focus. These records show you identified documentation deficiencies in operations 10 months ago and escalated warnings with increasing urgency. Yes, I confirmed. I also included the original compliance status reports I submitted to executive leadership, which clearly identified operations as having critical deficiencies. Gerald Hamilton interjected. These reports differ substantially from what was presented to the board. Alexandra turned to the next section. Miss Parker, this appears to show communication between operations leadership specifically directing staff to suspend enhanced documentation practices. Can you explain the context? These emails were discovered during our preparation for this examination. I explained calmly, though my heart was racing. They appear to show deliberate instructions to circumvent regulatory documentation requirements for certain clients and transactions. Marcus suddenly pushed back from the table. This is absurd. Jeanette is presenting internal communications out of context to deflect from compliance's failure to properly implement procedures. I remained composed. The final section includes evidence that documentation was deliberately removed from our systems after the audit was announced and instructions were given to create documentation retroactively. Timothy finally found his voice. This is enough, Miss Bennett. I request a brief recess to address these serious allegations internally before proceeding. Alexandra closed her folder deliberately. Mr. Bradford, based on what we have seen, the examination team will be referring this matter to our enforcement division. We are concluding this examination with findings of significant regulatory violations, including potential willful non-compliance and documentation falsification. Gerald Hamilton raised his hand. As Audit Committee Chair, I request a private conversation with the examination team before you finalize your findings. Of course, Alexandra agreed. Everyone except the board representatives and Miss Parker should leave the room. As executives filed out, Marcus stormed past me hissing, "You will regret this," before slamming the door behind him. Timothy looked shell-shocked, unable to even make eye contact as he left. With only board members, auditors, and myself remaining, Gerald spoke first. Miss Bennett Meridian acknowledges the serious compliance failures identified. However, it appears these failures were concentrated in one department under specific leadership, not reflective of our broader governance culture. Alexandra considered this carefully. That distinction will be relevant during enforcement proceedings. However, the board's oversight responsibilities remain a concern, particularly given the discrepancies between actual compliance status and what was reported to directors. We intend to address that immediately, Gerald assured her. Miss Parker has demonstrated exceptional integrity under difficult circumstances. The board will be taking immediate action based on her documentation. Alexandra turned to me. Miss Parker, your meticulous records will be essential to our investigation. I commend your professional courage. After the auditors departed, Gerald addressed me directly. Jeanette, what you did today was difficult but necessary. The board will be calling an emergency session this afternoon. Your documentation suggests misconduct that extends beyond regulatory violations into potential corporate governance failures. I felt oddly calm despite the chaos I had unleashed. I was simply doing my job. You did more than that, Gerald replied. You protected this institution from those who would compromise its integrity for short-term convenience. There will be significant changes coming, and we will need your continued honesty as we navigate them. As I walked back to my office, I passed Marcus's assistant, hurriedly clearing personal items from his desk. Throughout the compliance department, my team watched me with a mixture of awe and apprehension. The corporate earthquake I had triggered would have aftershocks for months to come, but for the first time in years I felt the weight of compromised integrity lifting from my shoulders. 3 weeks after that fateful final audit meeting, Meridian Financial Services operated under a cloud of regulatory supervision. The FSA had issued a consent order requiring comprehensive remediation of all compliance deficiencies, implementation of enhanced monitoring systems, and quarterly progress reports. The financial penalties, while substantial, were actually less severe than they might have been, largely due to the board's swift corrective actions. Marcus Reynolds had been terminated for cause the same day as the final audit meeting. Several operations managers who participated in documentation falsification were also dismissed. The most significant corporate casualty, however, was Timothy Bradford himself. The board determined that his failure to address compliance warnings and his tacit approval of Marcus's deception constituted a governance failure that required new leadership. I had been appointed interim chief compliance officer, a position I accepted with mixed emotions. The promotion acknowledged my integrity, but also placed the enormous burden of remediation squarely on my shoulders. The regulatory response was actually quite measured, I explained to Gerald during our weekly oversight meeting. They recognized that the misconduct was isolated to specific individuals rather than representing a company-wide culture of non-compliance. Gerald nodded. Your documentation made that distinction possible. Without your meticulous records, the entire organization might have been deemed fundamentally flawed. The remediation work was challenging and often thankless. My days began before sunrise and frequently ended well after sunset. Each transaction identified in the consent order required comprehensive review and correction. New documentation procedures needed development, testing, and implementation. Most difficult were the cultural changes required to ensure compliance was viewed as essential rather than optional. We need to rebuild our relationship with the regulators from the ground up. I told my expanded compliance team during our strategy session. That means not just addressing specific violations, but demonstrating a fundamental commitment to regulatory adherence. Changing the corporate culture proved even more difficult than fixing documentation systems. Departments accustomed to Marcus's dismissive attitude toward compliance initially resisted the more rigorous processes we implemented. Some managers complained about bureaucratic overreach when asked to follow basic regulatory requirements. Patrick, who remained as CFO, became an unexpected ally in this cultural transformation. I should have supported you earlier, Jeanette, he admitted during a late evening budget review. I saw the warning signs but prioritized departmental harmony over regulatory integrity. That was a mistake I won't repeat. His support proved crucial when funding was needed for enhanced compliance systems and additional staff. Where once compliance budget requests faced automatic resistance, now they received thoughtful consideration and usually approval. 2 months into the remediation process, the FSA conducted a follow-up examination to assess our progress. Alexandra returned as lead examiner, her professional demeanor unchanged despite our tumultuous history. Ms. Parker, she noted during the exit meeting, Meridian has made remarkable progress in addressing the consent order requirements. Your documentation frameworks are now among the most comprehensive we have seen in institutions of this size. This professional validation meant more to me than any promotion or compensation increase. We had transformed a regulatory crisis into an opportunity for institutional improvement. After 6 months of intensive remediation work, the board convened to consider permanent executive appointments. Gerald invited me to his office before the formal meeting. The board will be offering you the permanent chief compliance officer position today, he informed me. The compensation package includes executive-level benefits and board committee participation. The offer represented everything I had worked toward professionally, yet I felt uncertain. Gerald, I appreciate the confidence, but I need to be clear about something. I do not want to be a ceremonial executive who provides compliance window dressing while business continues as usual. If I accept this role, compliance considerations must be integrated into strategic decisions, not treated as an afterthought. Gerald smiled. That is precisely why we want you in this position. Meridian learned its lesson the hard way. The board now understands that regulatory integrity is fundamental to sustainable success, not an obstacle to it. I accepted the position, but chose to maintain my direct involvement with the compliance team rather than moving to a more removed executive role. This decision raised eyebrows among some executives who expected me to delegate the technical work while focusing on politics and presentations. I can manage strategy while maintaining technical understanding, I explained to my team. The moment I lose touch with regulatory details is the moment I become ineffective as an advocate for compliance. Richard, who had grown tremendously during the crisis, approached me after a particularly challenging implementation meeting. When I suggested whistleblowing months ago, you said it was the absolute last resort. Yet you essentially did exactly that when you revealed everything to the auditors. His observation made me reflect on my own evolution. There is a difference between external whistleblowing and internal truth-telling, I explained. I never went outside proper channels, but I refused to perpetuate deception within those channels. Sometimes integrity requires standing firm rather than walking away. The company culture gradually transformed under new leadership. The interim CEO promoted from our retail banking division made regulatory compliance a standing agenda item in every executive meeting. More importantly, compliance considerations became integrated into product development and strategic planning rather than treated as an afterthought. My relationship with operations underwent the most dramatic transformation. The new VP, formerly a regional director, with a strong compliance background, established weekly coordination meetings between our departments. Where once there had been antagonism, now there was collaboration. Your department is no longer the enemy, she told me during our quarterly review. You are the guardrails that keep us from driving off the regulatory cliff. A year after the fateful audit, Meridian passed a comprehensive regulatory examination with only minor findings. The consent order restrictions were lifted, and our regulatory reputation began its slow rehabilitation. The financial cost had been significant but not crippling. More importantly, the governance improvements positioned us for more sustainable long-term growth. The experience transformed me personally as well as professionally. I found my voice in executive meetings, no longer allowing myself to be silenced or dismissed. My communication style evolved from technical compliance language to more strategic framing that connected regulatory requirements to business outcomes. You know what I realized through all this, I told Abigail during our mentor lunch. Integrity isn't just about personal values. It is a professional asset that appreciates over time, even when it seems costly in the moment. This lesson became the foundation of the compliance training program I developed for new employees. Rather than focusing exclusively on rules and procedures, we emphasized ethical decision-making and the courage to maintain professional standards even under pressure. As I reflect on the journey from isolated compliance specialist to organizational change agent, I recognize that the hardest part was finding the courage to stand alone when necessary. In that final audit meeting, I had no guarantee the board would support my actions. I risked my career on the conviction that truth ultimately serves everyone better than comfortable deception. The measure of true professional courage isn't grand gestures or dramatic confrontations. It is the daily commitment to doing what is right, especially when doing so is inconvenient or unpopular. It is maintaining meticulous records not out of paranoia but professional responsibility. It is speaking truth to power not as rebellion but as service to the organization's true interests. What about you? Have you ever had to stand up for what was right in your professional life even when it felt risky? Comment below and share your experience. If you found value in my story, please subscribe to hear more tales of corporate integrity and professional courage. Like this video if you believe in the power of doing the right thing even when it is difficult, and share with someone who might need encouragement to stand firm in their professional ethics. Thank you for listening to my journey, and remember, in the long run, integrity is not just right, it is smart.